Brought to you by Patreon. Shout out to my contributors, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. If you enjoy this content, please remember to rate, comment, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, and to share with your neighbors on social media. Thank you again, and on to the video. Today we shall be responding to a settler colonial apologist, apartheid enjoyer, and genocide enthusiast YouTube channel by the name of travelingisrael.com. It is a channel ran by an inbred-looking tour guide who makes his living inviting people to visit the most racist country on the planet. Recently, he uploaded a video where he attempts to inject some nuance into the question of whether or not genocide and ethnic cleansing are bad things by lobbying his case against Palestinian national liberation, as well as presenting what he deems the Israeli perspective you've probably never heard. As of now, he has changed the original title of his video, simply titling it The Israeli Perspective Now, since he's probably realized how stupid it is to claim that this is some new profound position on the question with all of this additional nuance that we have yet to consider. Well, I've seen enough of this video to say first and foremost, spoiler warning, that this perspective is actually not new at all. On the contrary, it's the perspective we've all heard a million times. And it mostly involves deflecting blame onto the victims, presenting cherry-picked historical facts and statistics in a vacuum out of context, and arguing from a position of ignorance which completely falls apart when one considers the broader picture. And before we continue any further, I would just like to preface this essay by saying that right out the gates, that I do not like Hamas. I don't condone radical jihadism, religious extremism, or any sort of acts of terrorism. By virtue of actively murdering communists and socialists, I'll be the first to tell you that as a communist, I'm not exactly president of their fan club. That being said, like it or not, they are the biggest nationalist group resisting Israel at this time, and as I shall explain later, the Palestinians are completely within their legal right, according to international law, to take up arms in opposition to the Israeli government. I repeat, the Palestinian people are completely within their right taking up arms in rebellion.
If in 1948 there were around 700,000 Palestinians and today there are 7 million in the land of Israel, you can't really use this term. However, if you want to use the words ethnic cleansing, you can do so to describe what happened to the Jews in Arab countries. In Morocco in 1948 there were 265,000 Jews. Today there are around 2,000. In Iraq, there were 135,000 Jews in 1948. Today, there are fewer than 10. Algeria used to be home to 140,000 Jews. Today, there are fewer than 50, and I can go on. It is Muslim countries who perpetrated ethnic cleansing on the Jews.
Right out the gates, we're off to the good old tu quo fallacy, flagrant obfuscation, and statistics presented to us out of context. He brings up several Arab countries in which their sizable Jewish populations have shrunk and says that it was actually the Arabs who have been ethnically cleansing the Jews, since there are fewer Jewish people in these countries now than there were back in the 1940s. He also argues that because the Palestinian population has grown over the last several decades, that Palestinians are therefore not being ethnically cleansed. Excuse me? Have you ever taken a look at this map of Israeli settlements and the many instances in which the settlers have violently driven the indigenous Arabs from their homes at gunpoint? Even if that were true that the Palestinian population in totality has grown relative to what it used to be decades ago, that doesn't change the fact that roughly 6 million indigenous Palestinian refugees are currently living in exile in several countries across the Middle East. 6 million refugees that are currently in diaspora not of their own volition. In regards to this infograph, I Google food some information in regards to Morocco, Libya, Algeria, and Egypt's Jewish populations because I wanted to see if there were any actual forced expulsions of Jewish communities from these countries. And lo and behold, this is what I found. Now bear with me, I know that this is a Wikipedia article, and I'm one of the last people to reference Wikipedia whenever I'm about to cite something, but I am still going to quote it for the sake of brevity because this is what they have to say about Morocco. Quote, after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and due to domestic strife in the 1950s, the next several decades saw waves of Jewish emigrations to Israel, France, and Canada. Moroccan Jews emigrated for a variety of reasons, Some have emigrated for religious reasons, some faced persecution, and others left for better economic prospects than they faced in post-colonial Morocco. With every Arab-Israeli war, tensions between the Arabs and the Jews would rise, sparking more Jewish emigration. Most Jews in Morocco lived in desolate areas during the late 1930s. This was in part due to increased taxation by the French Protectorate. In 1936, Leon Blum, a Jewish man, was appointed as Prime Minister of France. This gave some Moroccan Jews hope that they may be able to become French citizens at some point. A small community of around 2,000 to 2,500 Jews live in Morocco today. However, in a rapidly increasing trend, young men from the community are emigrating to Israel and France. As of 2017, according to The Economist, quote, "No Arab country has gone to the lengths of Morocco to revive its Jewish heritage," unquote. The country has restored 110 synagogues and has the Arab world's only Jewish museum. More than 50,000 Israelis visit Morocco annually, unquote. Wikipedia article on Moroccan Jews. I proceeded to Control F the keywords ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, and genocide in the Wikipedia article, and lo and behold, there isn't a single mention of any of these keywords. You'd think a genocide or ethnic cleansing transpiring in Morocco would at least warrant a footnote in the article about it. Instead, there is no mention of such things ever happening to the Moroccan Jews. I skimmed through a number of other articles on the subject, and based on my findings, Mr. Israeli tour guide is not being honest. He says that the Jews have been ethnically cleansed from all of these countries. No, they haven't. That is a lie. You are being lied to. There was no ethnic cleansing of the Jews from Morocco, or anything resembling the scale of what Israel is currently doing to Palestine in any of these Arab countries. On the contrary, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish Moroccan natives emigrated to Israel after its founding in 1948 of their own volition. And I found similar trends taking place in Egypt, Iraq, and Algeria. Of course, this is not to say that there hasn't been any discrimination or hate crimes committed against the Jewish communities in these countries. However, to say that the Arab countries have systematically ethnically cleansed them, all by virtue of their respective Jewish populations, shrinking in the wake of waves of emigrations to Israel, is an egregious distortion and misrepresentation of the situation. No shit the Jewish populations in these countries has shrank over the last few decades. It is almost as though there was an ethno-state founded in their name, which has been actively enticing Jews from all across the globe to emigrate there and settle. The white European population also shrank when they were making waves of migrations to the Americas throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Does that make the white European settlers, who stole all of their land from the indigenous, the actual victims of genocide? Not the indigenous population that they violently drove off their lands, mass murdered, forcibly sterilized, and herded the remnants of on shitty little reservations 100 years after the fact? Before we go any further, let's take a look at what actual genocide and ethnic cleansing looks like. According to the United Nations, ethnic cleansing is defined as, quote, a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographical areas. And genocide is defined as, quote, crimes committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, in whole or in part. With these definitions in mind, let us critically examine the actions of the State of Israel, consider the motivations for said actions, and then derive our conclusions from there. Since Hamas launched its wave of missile strikes over the Gaza border wall on the 7th of October, Israel's response has been to declare open war on the Strip. Some 1.1 million Palestinian residents of northern Gaza, half of which are children, have been forced by the Israeli government at gunpoint to flee to southern Gaza, while the Israeli military moves in to bomb and bulldoze their homes and communities and make way for Israeli settlers. Since this war has started, Israel has cut off Gaza's access to food, water, and utilities, has actively blocked much-needed disaster relief supplies for Palestine, and has carried out a series of terror bombings across the northern half of the Strip, indiscriminately killing thousands of innocent people while deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, people's houses, and so on. As I write this, the IDF has orchestrated a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza, and they are doing this with the intent of seizing the northern half of the Gaza Strip and clearing out the indigenous population to make way for Israeli settlers. As of now, virtually half of Gaza has been destroyed as a result of these airstrikes, and the overwhelming majority of the deaths that have occurred in the wake of this siege have been civilian casualties. To make matters worse, it has been confirmed by multiple human rights organizations that the IDF are now making use of white phosphorus in their attacks, which, according to international law, is a straight-up war crime. Now, to be fair, it's already a war crime to deliberately target civilians, but you're not allowed to use white phosphorus during a war at all for very good reason. I won't show you any pictures of what white phosphorus does to human flesh because I don't want this video to get flagged. You can Google that on your own time, but you should know what the state of Israel is currently up to and the lengths that it will go to inflict pain, suffering, and death on other human beings. As of right now, the IDF has been reportedly murdering innocent journalists and their family members and anybody who dares speak out or provide media coverage of Israel's atrocities in Gaza. The Israeli regime has cut off all internet, power, and cell phone services to the Strip, as well in a deliberate effort to carry out a media blackout and slowing the spread of word of their crimes. As a result, the true extent of the ongoing starvation, preventable sickness, homelessness, and war crimes being carried out in Gaza has become difficult to document. Fortunately, the truth is still getting out there. I've heard stories and first-hand accounts of famine, lack of basic necessities such as toilet paper and drinkable water, and 100 or so people sleeping in crammed, overcrowded homes because their houses got bombed, etc. At the same time, any and all Palestinians living in Israel at the moment are under direct threat of imprisonment should they dare to speak out against Israeli atrocities and crimes against humanity. But wait, Mr. Touring Israel, I thought free speech was only a Western liberal value. According to you, it's only the Muslims that do censorship and authoritarianism and thought crime, and that you Israelis hail from a more modernized, freedom-loving culture and society. If Israel really is this bastion of freedom and democracy as you claim, then why is the Israeli state in the process of going out of its way to threaten and intimidate its detractors into silence? And speaking of freedom of speech and the press, in a broader effort to twist the narrative and manufacture consent for their genocide, the Israeli state media has been lying through its teeth about the conflict as well as willfully omitting other facts that undermine their agenda. Anybody remember when the IDF carried out a series of bombing raids on various hospitals across the Strip, denying that they ever carried out said raids, and then blaming Hamas for the attacks, only for loads of inconsistencies to be found in their version of the story, along with the fact that the IDF had already given the evacuation order to civilians in these hospitals before they got bombed? How about when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the Israeli state media, without any actual evidence or independent verification, based purely on hearsay, started to claim that Hamas had beheaded dozens of infant children during their attack, and the US president and mainstream media in the West just decided to run with it? Quote, a French reporter based in Jerusalem, Samuel Faure, said on X that he was in the Kfar Aza settlement, located less than 2 kilometers from northeastern Gaza, on Tuesday, but no one had mentioned the alleged decapitations. Arin Ziv, an Israeli photojournalist, likewise said that he saw no evidence of beheaded infants, while neither the Israeli army nor spokesperson also did not mention any such incidents. During the tour, journalists were allowed to speak to the hundreds of soldiers on site, without the supervision of the army's spokesperson team. I-24 reporter said that she heard it from soldiers. Soldiers I spoke with in Kfar Aza yesterday didn't mention the beheading of babies. The army spokesperson stated, "We cannot confirm at this point. We are aware of the heinous acts Hamas is capable of." Unquote. Quote, the White House has walked back President Joe Biden's claim that he saw pictures of beheaded children following Hamas's deadly attack on Israel. Quote, I never really thought I would see, have confirmed, pictures of terrorists beheading children, Biden said, who described Saturday's attack as the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. A White House spokesperson later clarified that U.S. officials and the president have not seen pictures or confirmed such reports independently, the Post reported on Wednesday, unquote. So now that we have established that the Israeli government and military are willing to spread lies and falsehoods in order to justify its actions and manufacture consent for its crimes, let us now discuss intent. In a long tweet by independent journalist group Mondoweiss, they explain the long-term plans of the Israeli Defense Ministry with Palestine. Quote, "In the plan being proposed by the Intelligence Ministry, Palestinians in Gaza would be displaced from Gaza to the northern Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. In the report, the ministry described different options for what comes after the invasion of Gaza, and the option deemed as liable to provide positive and long-lasting strategic results was the transfer of Gaza residents to Sinai. The move entails 3 steps: the creation of tent cities southwest of the Gaza Strip, the construction of a humanitarian corridor to assist the residents, and finally, the building of cities in northern Sinai. In parallel, a sterile zone, several kilometers wide, would be established within Egypt, south of the Israeli border, so that the evacuated residents would not be able to return," unquote. And so, with all things considered, I think it's safe to conclude that this is a genocide and ethnic cleansing, and Gaza is the world's largest concentration camp. That may sound a little hyperbolic to some, but think about this for a moment. What is a concentration camp? It is essentially a place where people are rounded up and sent to die, and Gaza meets all of the criteria necessary to be classified as such. It is the world's largest open-air prison, as the Israeli government wields direct control over the Palestinians' freedom of movement. It is the Israelis who decide who gets to enter Gaza and who gets to leave, who has to stay and who has to go. They control Gaza's access to food, water, and basic utilities, and can shut them off at will, which is exactly what they are doing right now. And it is the Israelis who decide who lives and who dies, as evidenced by the fact that the Israeli military is able to enter the Strip and indiscriminately kill who they please and bomb whichever targets that they like, and then deflect blame onto the Palestinian rebels for their crimes. This is not about disagreements, and this is not a complicated issue. There is no additional nuance or context worth taking into consideration here. One side is overwhelmingly the correct, pro-human, morally superior one, while the other is anti-human, psychopathic, and depraved. I stand with the correct position. I stand with the pro-human position. I stand with Palestine. And this asshole is just as ugly on the inside as he is on the outside. As I shall thoroughly demonstrate over the course of the rest of this video, this man is a racist, fascist, ethno-nationalist, pathological, genocide-supporting piece of shit who repeatedly telegraphs his hatred, fear, and bigotry and tendency towards pathologically bullshitting.
As a Jew, I care about what is going on with Jews all over the world, and I find it very odd that Christians don't really care about Nazareth or Bethlehem, which are kind of important to the followers of Jesus and used to be 80% Christians 50 years ago and now are 80% Muslims.
Take note of how threatened he feels by the mere presence of Arabs at the regions and holy sites that he mentions. He is so bothered by their very presence that he treats them as though they are an existential threat. The enemy is both weak and strong. This is the hallmark of a racist.
Same goes for Christians in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. In Nigeria, Muslim organizations have murdered thousands of Christians. 2 million Christians have fled Iraq and become refugees in the last 2 decades, but no one seems to care about it.
Why, yes, millions of Christians have fled Iraq and have become refugees in the last decade. I'm sure America's invasion of Iraq has had nothing to do with the ruining of the country and the making of it into an intolerable hell on earth, compelling millions of people to emigrate elsewhere around the world. Surely the ongoing crises aren't merely symptoms of the long-term consequences of the West's broader efforts to keep the Middle East plunged into chaos by constantly bombing it and actively funding, arming, and enabling theocratic fascists, far-right religious extremists, and Persian Gulf oil barons in a broader effort to undercut and destroy any sort of progressive secular alternative that might arise to challenge the status quo in the region. Nope. It's all because of radical Islam and those filthy brown people who are uniquely reactionary, violent, and uncivilized barbarians, much like orcs from Dungeons & Dragons. What he's saying here is nothing new. I've heard it all before. It's what right-wingers do constantly by taking material circumstances and outcomes that people are victims of, and then blaming the victims for said material circumstances and outcomes. It's no different than when race realists cherry-pick IQ statistics to justify their racism, completely ignoring environmental factors outside of the group's control, and then blaming the individuals for systematic outcomes rather than looking at the system which creates those outcomes in the first place.
So let's talk about the story the Palestinians like to tell and the media like to repeat. The Palestinians lived in Palestine for hundreds of years. They lived peacefully alongside a small Jewish minority until the rise of Zionism, a colonialist movement which, under the umbrella of the European imperial powers, started kicking the Palestinians out of their land and homes, causing the current situation. And now for the facts. In the long history of the...
That is essentially what is happening right now, yes. And I love how he just finishes his tangent with "nuh-uh." Guess we better hang it up here, boys, because Mr. Genocide Enthusiast has told us no. Therefore, the answer must be no. Fuck facts, logic, or evidence. He is just automatically right by virtue of wishing it so. Wow, you sure proved us wrong, Mr. Tour Guide. Are you an expert?
Land of Israel, there was never such a thing as a Palestinian people until the 20th century. Millions of pilgrims have come to the land of Israel over the last 3,000 years. They've come across Jews, Arab, Christians, Muslims, Druze, Turks. They've never met a Palestinian.
More obfuscation and telling us what to think without a shred of evidence. The fact of the matter is that Palestine was an internationally recognized sovereign nation long before the Israeli settlers stepped foot in the region. During the 1800s, the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, which they had inherited after the collapse of the Byzantines, and Palestine was the word used by the Western powers to classify the territory. While some of its boundaries were poorly defined at the time, the point is that the Ottomans were governing the region and enforcing a clearly defined legal system that was in place. And even if Palestine wasn't a nation, it was still home to millions of indigenous Arabic tribes and communities that were violently driven from their homes by the Israeli settlers. And what Mr. Tour Guide is doing here is trying to erase their national identity and pretend that there wasn't an already established group here with land and territory of its own, as to delegitimize their claim.
Right to identify yourself however you like, but you don't have the right to reinvent history. And the history of the region is very clear. This is probably the most documented piece of land on the planet. There is a very good book, a very ancient and popular book about the connections of the Jews to Judea. It is called the Bible. Now, wait. I know what you are thinking. He's going to say that God gave this land to the Jews. And no, if you believe that...
And there you have it. While the Palestinians all have a directly traceable lineage and independently verifiable material connection to the land, the Zionists have a book of fairy tales saying that it was theirs thousands of years ago. Let me make something clear. Nobody, not a single Jewish person alive today, can prove that they are a living descendant of the ancient Hebrews who dwelled in Israel thousands of years ago, nor do they even possess the means to demonstrate this much. And even if they could demonstrate without a shadow of a doubt that they are direct descendants to the original tribes of Israel, it still wouldn't give them the right to steal Palestinian land because what happened to the Israelites is ancient history. They're not the ones who have been living and dwelling on this land for centuries. The indigenous Arabs are, while most of the Israelis and their immediate ancestors are of white, Western European descent. And your holy book is not credible proof that this land is yours or that said land belongs to your ancient ancestors.
God gave this land to the Jews, great. And if not, also great. The undeniable point is that there is a strong connection between the Jews and the land of Israel. There are thousands of books from the last 3,000 years that write about Jews and the land of Israel. And in archaeological digs, we find Jewish coins, Jewish texts, and Jewish artifacts. There isn't a single book or piece of archaeological evidence that point to a Palestinian people. You don't like what I'm saying? Then prove me wrong.
I find it funny how Zionists today will make religious appeals and claim that they are indigenous because their ancient ancestors may or may not have dwelled in Palestine 2,000 years ago, while the founding fathers of their ideology straight up recognized that what they were doing was conquest, land theft, and settler colonialism. Back in the day, when settler colonialism and racism were more broadly socially acceptable, Zionists didn't feel the need to sugarcoat anything. They were just like, oh, I need your land, your resources, I'm genocidal. Quote, we should form there a form of portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia and an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The sanctuary's Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning them an extraterritorial status, such as is well known to the law of nations. We should form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence, unquote. Theodor Herzl, The Jewish State. Quote, it is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consents of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted, and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. This is equally true of the Arabs. They feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico, and the Sioux for their rolling prairies. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. This is what the Arabs of Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel, unquote. Vladimir Jabotinsky, The Iron Wall. Quote, the iron law of every colonizing movement, a law which knows no exceptions, a law which existed in all times under all circumstances. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must provide a garrison on your behalf, or else give up your colonization. For without an armed force which will render physically impossible any attempts to destroy or prevent this colonization, colonization is impossible. Not difficult, not dangerous, but impossible. Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force, unquote. Vladimir Jabotinsky again, The Iron Law, page 13. And so the Zionists outwardly knew that what they were doing was settler colonialism, and it was something that they were consciously planning for decades up to the colonization of Israel. The native Arabs are by definition indigenous, while the Israelis are by definition colonizers. For the sake of brevity, because this video is already very long, I'm going to be skipping through the majority of his historical segments, because he's not really making any points that I want to single out and address in particular. He's mainly just presenting the history of the conflict from an incredibly slanted pro-Israel bias, where he just straight up admits the numerous instances of Israeli war crimes being carried out on civilian populations. So let me present you guys with some actual history, as told by the Empire Files' very own Abbey Martin.
For 2 weeks, the Empire Files team traveled the West Bank and Palestine. What we saw was one of the biggest human rights disasters on the planet. A brutal and growing military occupation that thrives off US sponsorship, soon to be strengthened even more by another $38 billion in US tax dollars, the largest military aid deal in history. This stark reality is never taught to us in school. And whenever we do hear about Palestine in the media, it might as well be directly from the Pentagon.
Many people have seen this famous map, showing the ever-shrinking borders of Palestine. But likely far less people could explain why the borders have changed so dramatically. First, how did these original borders of Palestine form, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea? The countries of the modern Middle East were once the same swath of territory owned by the Ottoman Empire.
Millions of pilgrims have come to the land of Israel over the last 3,000 years. They've never met a Palestinian.
Of the nearly 500,000 people living in Ottoman Palestine, 75% were Muslim, 20% Christian, and 5% Jewish. Nearly 100% were Arab. Its cities, especially Jerusalem, were buzzing hives of Arab art and culture. a destination for intellectuals across the Middle East. Before Palestine had borders, it was a recognizable nation, its cultural identity is distinct, with deep roots in the land. But Zionism, however marginalized, became a fervent political movement, led by its proclaimed father, Theodor Herzl, an Austrian atheist. While first considering Argentina and Uganda as a homeland, the Zionist movement claimed rights to what it called Greater Israel, which includes all of Palestine and part of today's Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt.
There is a very good book, a very ancient and popular book about the connections of the Jews to Judea. It is called the Bible.
Their right to this land was based on the ancient biblical kingdoms of the Old Testament, which disappeared 600 years before the birth of Jesus. Herzl's job became jet-setting around the world, lobbying those in power he thought would be sympathetic to his project. The Zionists, more than anything, needed money to fund settlements, and ultimately a decree from the world's colonial powers. Herzl wrote to the Grand Duke of Baden, "If it is God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, we should like to do so as representatives of Western civilization and bring cleanliness, order, and well-established customs to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient." The early Zionists promised to make Palestine a vanguard against barbarism.
The assertion that there were no people in Palestine prior to Zionist settlements became the keystone of their policies. They were always very well aware of the people there.
In the words of another leading Zionist, Israel Zangwill, Palestine is not so much occupied by the Arabs as overrun by them.
From its inception, political Zionism was not only a plan for colonization and expansion, but one of expulsion of the land's indigenous inhabitants.
Much of historic Palestine was semi-feudal, with farmers living and working on land owned by wealthy individuals who lived far away in fancy cities of Syria and Jordan. Zionist settlers began purchasing this land in 1882. Many evicted its indigenous people to build the first settlements. Despite Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in relative harmony for thousands of years, this spread immediate tension and conflict.
This was the age of the fall of empires, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire.
With the Zionist project getting a slow start, a new opportunity presented itself with the outbreak of World War I. Herzl and his partners knew the victors would be slicing up the colonies of the losers, which included Palestine. Aristocrats from Great Britain, France, and Russia were secretly carving up the Middle East amongst themselves. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement drew new borders, creating Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the first formal borders of Palestine. It was put under British colonial control. Riots in Jerusalem protested the takeover by yet another empire. With Ottoman Palestine becoming British Mandate Palestine, the Zionist movement had won a major step. With the flick of a wrist, a small group of British lords issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging to help achieve this objective.
The Zionist movement was a national movement, not a colonialist or an imperialist movement.
The British made it much easier for well-funded settlement projects to take more Palestinian land, dispossessing even more people.
Yet Zionists' aim for a homeland in all of Greater Israel, without the indigenous Arabs, was still driving them. In 1919, a U.S. envoy reported, the Zionists looked forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. Settlers had now become 10% of the population, growing with large donations from Western tycoons. The settlements had already created a refugee crisis. This photo from 1929 depicts a rally in Syria of Palestinian refugees, of which there were 50,000. With this new backing, the colonial project picked up its pace, purchasing even larger chunks of earth from the feudal landlords and creating small pockets of territory. Finally, in 1947, the 70-year-long lobbying campaign to be granted a formal state came to fruition. The British Crown turned its colony of Palestine over to the United Nations, which cut it into pieces, changing this phase of Palestine's map, speckled with small dots of settler territory, into this, the Jewish state of Israel, which was created on top of another country, gifted with 55% of its land.
Land ownership for Palestinians plummeted. Before 1948, Palestinians owned 90% of the land. 4 years later, they owned only 3%.
In the first half of the 20th century, millions of people moved from one place to another to create nation-states. What's special about the Jews is that they never stole or used violence to take any land in the land of Israel. I'm always getting comments from Muslims and pro-Palestinians about Jews stealing the land from the local Arabs. Here is a challenge for you. Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
Leader in the settlement movement, Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister and mascot for Tel Aviv's airport, wrote about the early days. We were not just working. We were conquering land. We were a company of conquistadores. From 1920 to 1939, the settler population rose from 10 to 30%, and there was no confusion about what they were there to do. As Gurion himself said, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. Throughout these years, Palestinians launched several attacks on the encroaching settlements. Big clashes between settlers and Palestinians in cities grew deadly, killing many on both sides. But an era of wildly disproportionate death was about to begin. On a single day in the village of Jaffa, they demolished over 200. This uprising was drowned in blood by the sheer force of the British imperial machine by 1939. 5,000 Palestinians were left dead. On the other side, 300 settlers and 250 British soldiers. President of the Jewish National Fund, a group designated to reclaim the land of Israel, Joseph Weitz, wrote in 1940, "There was no room for both people in this country, and there is no way, besides transferring the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, to transfer them all. We must not leave a single village, a single tribe."
Here is a challenge for you. Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
Deir Yassin, a village with no reported resistance, was stormed by settler militia. They bombed homes, committed mass rape of women before executing them, and other atrocities. One child survivor tells the harrowing account of his entire family being lined up and shot, including his mother, as she breastfed her newborn baby. 200 people were murdered. According to a Red Cross official who visited the site days later, here, the cleaning up had been done with machine guns and hand grenades. It had been finished off with knives.
Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
Just 12 days later, Jewish forces bombed and raided the heavily populated city of Haifa, while sadistically broadcasting horror recordings over loudspeakers of Arab women wailing, and messages like, "Flee for your lives. The Jews are using poison gas and nuclear weapons." In Abu Shusha, Israeli forces attacked and occupied the village.
Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
The Palestinians that stayed in their homes were punished with rape and hacked to death with axes. Fleeing villagers were shot on sight. 60 people were officially killed, but years later, 52 more bodies were found in a mass grave. Al-Dawayima was also captured by Israeli forces, who murdered its men, women, and children. 200 bodies were found, with another 250 missing.
Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
Days later, Israeli troops marched into the village of Saliha and blew up a mosque, killing the nearly 80 people taking refuge inside. After the remaining villagers were ordered into the square, Israeli troops unleashed a rain of bullets upon them from machine guns mounted on armored vehicles, murdering another 70 people. One of the few survivors from the brutal attack recounts the bodies being left to rot for days before they were bulldozed into a mosque and blown up. Those who tried to resist in any way were collectively punished.
Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs.
One of the bloodiest of the massacres during the 1948 war was in the town of Lydia, where soldiers indiscriminately killed nearly every civilian in sight after gunshots were allegedly fired from a nearby mosque. State forces threw grenades into windows and shot those escaping their burning homes. According to Israeli military sources, 250 people were killed in just 30 minutes. This terror campaign largely accomplished what it set out to do. In each of these villages, and in hundreds more, the Arab population left in its entirety. Eyewitness British General John Bagot-Glubb doesn't hide the colonial savagery. It would be an exaggeration to claim that great numbers were massacred, but just enough were killed, or roughly handled, to make sure that all the civilian population took flight.
Jews stole prior to the War of Independence. On the other hand, I can give you lots of names of Jewish villages that Arabs, or Palestinians if you will, destroyed before 1948. Take Hebron, for example. Jews lived in Hebron for hundreds of years. In 1929, the Arabs, not 1 or 10, but whole gangs of Arabs, murdered 70.
The 1929 Hebron massacre was part of a larger series of anti-Zionist rioting that was taking place in Palestine throughout the 1920s as part of a broader reaction to the Balfour Declaration, which had just handed off huge chunks of Palestine to the Israeli settlers on a silver platter without any consideration for the indigenous Arabs. But this was not the only catalyst for the massacre. For years leading up to that point, the Jews and the Muslims were feuding over the status of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, a sacred holy site of sorts for all followers of the Abrahamic religions. Throughout the 1920s, tensions steadily escalated between the Arabs and the Jewish settlers for control over the Western Wall, with growing fears amongst the Muslim population that the Jews were going to forcibly seize the holy site for themselves, since wealthy Zionists had repeatedly attempted for years to buy the Western Wall from the British on multiple occasions, and even demanded that the British expropriate the wall and hand it off to the Israelis. Needless to say, on August 14, 1929, hundreds of Jewish nationalists marched to the Western Wall holding up inflammatory signs and chanting slogans such as "This wall is ours." Rumors quickly spread throughout the community that Jewish nationalists were carrying out killings against some of the local Arabs. So in direct reaction to this news, along with the aforementioned historical backdrop of settler colonialism that was transpiring at this time, is what became the main catalysts driving this massacre. It is worth noting that while the Arabs were responsible for carrying out these rapes and mass killings, it was also thanks to the Arabs that the majority of the Jewish community within Jerusalem survived, as numerous Arabic families actively harbored and sheltered the Jews in their homes in secret as to protect them from the violent, angry mobs. So you see, it was primarily a minority of violent extremists perpetuating this terror, while the lion's share of the domestic Arabs went out of their way to ensure the safety and survival of the Jewish community. Does Mr. Touring Israel mention this fact? No. How about the fact that it was predominantly the Israeli settlers that were indirectly responsible for provoking this attack by antagonizing the indigenous population in the first place? Also no. Instead, he utilizes this massacre along with the numerous other acts of Arabic retaliation against the Israeli settlers that were actively antagonizing them as evidence that it is not the Israelis that are the ones stealing the land, it's those filthy brown Arabs. It's not us, it's their fault. This is quite literally projection. He is projecting the crimes committed by the Zionists onto their victims, and saying that they're the ones that are responsible, not us. Anyways, for the sake of time, I'm not going to even dignify the rest of his historical segments with a response because, for one, this video is starting to run a bit too long for my taste, and two, he spends it completely ignoring the context of Israeli settler colonialism. And as I have shown thus far, his entire narrative completely falls apart once said context is factored and taken into account. So I can safely dismiss the rest of this segment, seeing as it is full of inaccuracies and completely lacking the additional context necessary to understand the entire situation.
One which Westerners don't understand anymore, religion, and one which Westerners don't want to talk about, values. Religion plays no role at all in European politics. In the US, politicians do say God bless America, and the debate surrounding abortion is partly religious. But when it comes to foreign policies, you don't hear American generals talk about spreading the word of Jesus. In the Muslim world, it is very different. When Arabs kill Jews at a music festival, or Christians in a school in Nigeria, or one another in Syria, Yemen, Libya, what is it they shout? Allahu Akbar, God is great. Jihad is a religious war against the infidels. To many Europeans, the words infidels and heresy probably remind them of dark days that played out hundreds of years ago, when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other. Sadly, this is still the situation in some parts of the Muslim world. Just think about the organizations you hear about in the Muslim world: Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Taliban. These aren't national organizations. They are all religious organizations. The fact that most of the Muslim countries aren't democratic has nothing to do with the US. The fact that 17 of the 20 most dangerous countries for the LGBTQ community are Muslims has nothing to do with colonialism. The fact that almost all of the most dangerous places in the world to be Christians are Muslim has nothing to do with imperialism.
Source? Trust me, bro. Just trust me. This is just flat out denial. Once again, viewer, you are being lied to. Allow me to explain the truth with concrete examples along the way, something that this delusional Zionist will never, ever give you in the entirety of this video or the entirety of the content on this channel. In regards to radical jihadism and religious fundamentalism in the Middle East, a great deal of the right-wing zealotry that you see today is a byproduct of US and Western foreign policy as a whole. The Taliban were formed from the remnants of the Mujahideen, whom were armed and trained by the CIA to fight against the Soviet Red Army in Afghanistan and to overthrow the secular governments in the region that had formed there. Another example, Saddam Hussein was backed by the CIA, as they provided him everything that he needed to become dictator of Iraq, and he was on good terms with the US throughout the 1980s. At least until he decided to nationalize his oil fields. Only then did he become an evil tyrant that needed to be stopped. The Islamic Republic of Iran, as we know it today, is also a direct byproduct of CIA meddling, as with the toppling of the democratically elected progressive leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, and the reinstallation of the Shah in the 1950s, Iran found itself governed by a monarchical puppet dictator who was down to simply let the West exploit his country for oil. Under such a context, the mosques became the only place where people could gather and organize in private without fear of having their heads cut off, and so that's exactly what they did, coalescing into a revolution in the late 1970s in which a religious nationalist government under the Grand Ayatollah seized power. But what of Saudi Arabia? They're Wahhabi Muslims. They subscribe to the most hardline, ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam that there is. They treat their women like shit, throw gay people off of rooftops, and behead people in the town square for witchcraft and sorcery. And yet they're on the UN Human Rights Council and are still close allies to the United States. When you get down to the brass tacks, there have been many secular, progressive, leftist, civil rights movements and national liberation struggles all across the Middle East, and in each and every single instance, the United States and its allies have been there actively trying to undermine and destroy them. Every single time, it has been the United States and the West at large that have been backing all of these ultra-conservative religious extremist groups while actively stomping out any and all progressive secular elements that have emerged. At the same time, the Western powers have been actively fucking with the Middle East and its people nonstop for decades, and you're surprised when the only outlets for resistance against the West happen to be the same radical jihadist groups that our governments have been arming and funding in order to fight socialism and progressive secularism and progressive movements in the region over the last 4 to 5 decades. This is the real reason why the Middle East is a misogynistic, theocratic cesspit and hotbed of reaction and conflict. Tell you what, Mr. Israeli tour guide, if you have a problem with religious extremism, maybe you should oppose the United States and the State of Israel since they're the #1 sponsors and enablers of it. If you want Palestinians to stop joining organizations such as Hamas, maybe stop bombing and starving them so they aren't compelled to join Hamas for the sake of self-preservation in the first place. Hamas is only a problem because of the State of Israel. There is no Hamas without Israel. And as long as Israel continues to oppress Palestine, the Palestinians will take up arms in active resistance. In the face of this, a liberal may ask, but why do they have to be so violent? Why can't they peacefully resist? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason for this is because they have tried on numerous occasions to do just that. And what was the IDF's response in every single instance? To gun them down and shoot them dead on the spot. So you see, the Palestinians aren't taking up arms against the State of Israel because of anti-Semitism or religious zeal. They're doing so because they're quite literally fighting for their lives in a war that your government started, Mr. Tour Guide. Before we go any further, I would now like to shift gears for a moment and go on a tangent in regards to Hamas, since they're the primary scarecrow used by Zionists to justify their crimes committed against the indigenous Arabs. One of the main contributing factors to the rise of Hamas was none other than the State of Israel itself. Through a myriad of passive, indirect, and sometimes direct means, the State of Israel enabled and showed favor to Hamas as a counter to the Soviet-backed PLO in the 1970s. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO for short, for those of you who do not know, was the original Palestinian political party that claims to represent the Palestinian people against the State of Israel. It was a secular organization founded in the 1970s with a strong socialist presence within it. And for the State of Israel, this was no good. The last thing that they wanted was for the face of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement to be represented by a peaceful, secular organization with strong left-leaning tendencies, because then it could swell in popularity and put the legitimacy of the State of Israel into question. And so, in a cynical move to circumvent the PLO, the State of Israel showed favor towards and provided indirect support for Hamas, since it is much easier to delegitimize the Palestinian national liberation struggle if its face has been co-opted by a bunch of right-wing zealots and religious extremists, not to mention the fact that with Hamas as the face of Palestinian resistance, it is much easier for the Israeli media, along with idiots such as touringisrael.com, to frame this as a religious conflict, where he and the civilized, freedom-loving West are on one side, and the backwards, tyrannical desert barbarians are on the other.
Look at the Jews. 1/3 of them were murdered by the Nazis. Israel has no oil and it is surrounded by enemies, and yet we are successful. And it's not because of American money. Most of that money has to be used to buy military equipment from American companies. And beside, the Palestinians get way more money. We are successful because we are open-minded, think outside the box, invest in education, and are not violent.
Yes, idiot. The state of Israel thrives because it receives billions of dollars in US taxpayer subsidies on a yearly basis. As a matter of fact, America gives more economic assistance to the state of Israel than any other country on earth. Since 1946, Israel has received more aid from America than the entirety of the continent of Africa combined. And it isn't just for military equipment either. Your country thrives because America allows it to thrive. If you think that your nation is truly capable of standing on its own 2 feet for a single day without receiving huge amounts of subsidies from the US, then I have a bridge to sell you. Since the Balfour Declaration at the end of World War I, wealthy donors and business folk alike from all across the US and Western Europe have generously donated millions upon millions of dollars to the Israelis to form their settlements and start their businesses. Your fascist ethno-state would be nothing without its backing and blessing from the West. It has nothing to do with how creative, liberal, or uniquely special your country actually is. On top of the fact that Israel isn't some ultra-peaceful progressive bastion in the Middle East either, throughout this video he has framed Israel as this beacon of progressivism, tolerance, freedom, and democracy, when nothing could be further from the truth. For one, your country doesn't even allow gay people to marry. So that's one strike against your progressive card. For two, Israel is objectively the most racist country on the planet. Well, besides the United States. Your country treats black people like second-class citizens and at one point had them rounded up and forcibly sterilized. Your government and military is in the process of expelling Palestinians from their homes and carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Your country is an ultra-religious, right-wing, theocratic dictatorship of its own. So you are in no position to call out your neighbors for being right-wing theocracies and human rights abusers when that is undoubtedly what the state of Israel is. Your country has a long history of constantly starting wars, terrorizing, and antagonizing its neighbors to boot. And don't get me wrong, the Nazis were evil and the Holocaust was a tragedy, but just because the Jewish people fell victim to the Holocaust does not give your people the right to subject another group of people that have never wronged them or you to do a Holocaust of your own. When the Nazis genocide the Slavs and the Jews, it's bad, but when the Zionists genocide the indigenous Arabs in the name of the Jews, that's somehow okay? The cognitive dissonance of this man recognizing the evils of German fascism, but failing to reach these same conclusions when it comes to Israeli fascism is absolutely astounding to me. But then again, I would expect no less from a fucking settler. I shall now make my final point on Zionism and the harm it does to the Jewish community. For all of Zionism's proclamations of being a pro-Jewish ideology and upholding the best interests of the Jewish people, it is in practice actively doing harm to them. Zionism and Judaism are not one and the same, regardless of how much the Zionists pretend that they are. Judaism is an ancient religion and ethnic group dating back for thousands of years, while Zionism is a fascist, white supremacist, ethno-nationalist ideology that was conceived of fairly recently, taking direct inspiration from the likes of the Founding Fathers' Manifest Destiny, as well as the Nazis' Lebensraum. And by constantly conflating Zionism with Judaism, the Zionists actively harm the Jews because in carrying out these atrocities and crimes against humanity in the name of Judaism, and constantly drawing the association of Judaism with Zionist ethno-nationalism, it actively creates and inspires actual anti-Semitism among many of its victims because now they perceive Judaism and Zionism as one and the same. In this way, the Zionists are sowing hatred and resentment towards the Jews and inspiring anti-Semitism amongst the surrounding Arab populations whose lives are currently being destroyed by the State of Israel. And so in direct retaliation, they do what any human being backed into a corner and denied the basic necessities of life would do, and they lash out. And when they do inevitably lash out, they do so in an incredibly disorganized, reckless, ineffective, and poorly thought out manner, since again, this violence is by definition not action but reaction. And so in a similar manner that we communists seemingly always have to answer for the excesses and blunders of Stalin and Mao, the Jewish people are now finding themselves in a situation where they have to answer for the crimes of the Israeli government thanks to this guilt by association that has been drawn. So for the sake of actual peace and conflict resolution in the Middle East, it stands to reason that Zionism, the most violent and aggressive tendency in the region, must be opposed and destroyed, and it will be destroyed. The state of Israel will not last forever. It is a project that is doomed to fail at its inception because more and more people are waking up and realizing how fucking evil this country is. Your government is currently being exposed for what it actually is. The truth of your lies are coming to light. And the facts that you have to frame the Israeli settlers as indigenous is the testimony to the fact that more and more, racism and settler colonialism are no longer socially acceptable. So in order to conjure the political will necessary to maintain the state of Israel, you people increasingly find yourselves needing to lie, obfuscate, distort the facts, and move the goalpost. Historically, these tactics work, and they will work well enough for a time. But eventually, you will fail, as right-wing reaction is always doomed to fail. Israel will fall, Palestine will win, and there is nothing you can do about it.